Welcome back to the Rescue Mission Podcast by City Vision University, where we bridge tradition and innovation. To help build that bridge, Season 1 of our podcast is focused on the history and values of rescue missions, while Season 2 is focused primarily on innovations and best practices relevant to rescue missions. You can find the show notes for this episode and subscribe to our newsletter at rescuemissions.cityvision.edu.
Let's dive into a story that's, well, woven into the very foundations of our cities, really. A history of lives profoundly changed, but it's often hidden, not the story you hear every day. We're talking about a movement driven by this heroic spirit, a profound sense of, rescue.
That's right. And our guide today is a fascinating source provided by one of our listeners, Dr. W.E. Paul's book, The Romance of Rescue. And this edition, it's got a special significance. It's dedicated both to the founders of gospel and rescue missions, and also at the request of the International Union of Gospel Missions to Dr. Paul's own memory.
Yeah, that title, Romance of Rescue, it really grabs you. And the book itself helps us out, defining romance, not like a love story, but more like an epoch, or a story full of these heroic, marvelous, even the sort of supernatural events drawn from history.
Exactly. And then rescue is just what you'd think, saving someone from danger, from difficulty. So the title really sets the stage, doesn't it? It's promising this historical account packed with these extraordinary moments of, deliverance.
So our mission for this deep dive, digging into your source material here, is to explore that historical journey and the core principles, right, of gospel and rescue missions, as Dr. Paul laid them out, understanding where they came from, how they changed over time, and the spirit, the thing that really drove them, all through his factual take on it.
Right. So let's unpack this idea that rescue work has these really deep historical roots. The book, right off the bat, pushes back against the idea that this is some modern invention. It argues the concept is, as old as Scripture itself.
It starts right at the beginning, doesn't it? It actually points to the very first rescue mission prospects as Adam and Eve needing saving after the fall.
Mm-hmm. And the first city being the land of Nod, which the book describes as RV wanderer, like a place of restless struggle.
And then the first message of rescue. The source says it's simply repentance.
Leading, it argues, to the very first missioner, Enoch, way back in those early biblical stories.
What's fascinating here is how the source frames rescue work, not as some program somebody invented, but as this fundamental human and spiritual need that's been there from the get-go. It also points to ancient relief efforts, like Joseph feeding Egypt during that famine, as these early examples of really practical aid.
And that powerful early evangelism, too, highlighting Jonah preaching in Nineveh. The book presents that citywide conversion, triggered by Jonah just preaching on the streets as one of history's biggest examples of that kind of thing.
Okay, fast forward to the New Testament. The book notes how much of Jesus' own ministry seemed to sort of prefigure this future mission work. He spent a lot of time in the kinds of places where missions would later pop up.
Yeah, his specific instructions on giving alms are mentioned. The source actually claims no social worker has ever improved on his technique there. And that practical, friendly approach of Peter and John with the beggar actually taking him by the hand, lifting him up, not just dropping a coin.
You also see his personal work, right? Nicodemus, the woman at the well, and even house-to-house stuff, like in Capernaum.
The rescue of the woman caught in adultery, that's in John 7.LM, is highlighted too, and how he affirmed children, saying, "Of such is the kingdom of heaven."
And there's an interesting bit about how Jesus took offerings, which the source says kind of reversed modern methods. He focused on the small gift and proportionate giving from the wealthy, rather than starting by asking for big donations first.
Now, here's where the source makes a really compelling point about early Christianity's impact. It describes how converts, maybe coming back from hiding or even prison, they bore this powerful witness just through their changed lives.
Right. These were people society knew, right? As thieves, drunkards, troublemakers. And then suddenly others are asking, wait, wasn't that guy a thief? Look how honest he is now. Or didn't he used to cause fights? Look how good a citizen he's become.
And the source makes this, frankly, remarkable claim that this visible, tangible change in these, quote, wicked and uncontrolled men was so powerful, so undeniable, that it actually led Caesar to proclaim Christianity the religion of Rome, based purely on the evidence of these transformed lives.
Wow. Yeah. That's a powerful argument. The idea that widespread personal change could have that direct, massive societal and political impact. The book also touches briefly on similar work in the Middle Ages, comparing it to missionary efforts, like a group from Carthage sailing to Britain to preach to the poor and give aid.
Okay, shifting across the ocean, the book tackles that common belief about the Jerry McAuley Water Street mission being the very first in America.
Right, and it clarifies that. While McAuley's The Helping Hand on Water Street, founded 1872, is probably the oldest one still running, there were definitely earlier missions. The source points out that McAuley himself talked about having a really significant conversation at the Howard mission before he even started his own work.
So the movement was already there, even if his mission became the most famous one that survived. The book explains what happened to a lot of those early efforts. Some just grew into churches or chapels, others kind of faded away as the neighborhood changed or the needs shifted, and some just ran out of money and closed.
But the spirit was there early on. The book talks about the Western Seamen's Friend Society, organized way back in 1830 in Cleveland, working with guys on the canals and boats.
Yeah, and this is where you see the potential for broad impact. From that little mission, their Sunday school grew into actual education classes. And get this, the city council apparently took over a school. The mission started for kids who couldn't read. The source credits this with growing into Cleveland's public school system.
A mission directly seeding a city's public education. That's an incredible piece of history.
Cincinnati, also around 1830, shows the sheer breadth of what these early missions did. Their Bethel lodging house sheltered over 68,000 people in just 1 year, 1865. But it wasn't just beds. They ran a nursery, caring for thousands of kids, a medical department seeing thousands of patients. They offered relief loans, and remarkably, most got paid back. They had an outing camp, gardens, legal aid, clubs, classes. Later, they even added an employment department and a home for working girls. It was massive.
Duluth Bethel, starting in 1873, is noted because right from the start it adopted that motto, no creed but Christ and no law but love. They focused on open-air meetings, jail visits, and charitable work for homeless men, strangers, needy families.
And the source suggests that the actual term rescue missions probably came about in Syracuse, New York, around 1888, with a couple named H.B. Gibbon and his wife.
This name, the book thinks, connected back to those earlier rescue bands that helped escaping slaves find safe places, food, and directions to freedom.
Exactly. Gibbon took that model, providing beds, food, shelter, and explicitly tied it to pointing people to Christ for spiritual freedom. Referencing that verse, John 8.36, "If the Son shall make you free, ye shall be free indeed."
So after McAuley's success, these missions started popping up more rapidly, often called Helping Hand, Rescue, or Gospel Mission. The book notes they frequently used Bible names or names related to their location, but it was pretty rare for one to be named after a person.
Okay, so let's dig a bit deeper. How does the source define what a rescue mission fundamentally is?
Well, it starts with the word itself, tracing mission back to the Latin mitter, which means to send.
And its primary function, stated very clearly in the book, is to win souls to Christ. It's seen as this outstation, right? A place to bring converts to faith, and then importantly, transfer them to established churches for nurturing and training. The source really stresses this is key to avoid just poaching members for one denomination.
And that connects right back to that motto we keep hearing. No creed but Christ, no law but love. The book unpacks this. It says, okay, the convert accepts Christ as Savior. A creed might give structure to beliefs, but the absolute essential thing is having Christ in heart and soul. Contrasting this with just empty formality, the whitened sepulchres.
And no law but love is framed as trying to get past all the arguments about church rules or methods. Let's start with the absolute foundation, the non-negotiable. Ye must be born again.
The mission, then, according to this source, is meant to be constructive, positive, characterized by this simple story of transformation.
And its relationship with the church is vital. The mission provides the fruits, right? The changed lives. And it directs those converts to the church they choose. This interaction is also seen as strengthening the faith of existing church members because they witness these powerful changes firsthand.
And again, the source loops back to history, saying missions are as old as the scriptures, pointing to things like the cities of refuge or Jonah's work.
To really get the feel of this work, the book spends a good chunk of time on a deep dive into Jerry McAuley's story. A lot of it seems to be in his own words, which makes it really vivid.
Oh, it's incredibly raw.
Yeah.
He talks about his father being a counterfeiter, a neglected childhood, no school, growing up on Water Street, involved in prize fighting, thieving, basically a river rat, as he put it.
Sentenced to 15 years for a crime he insisted he didn't do, initially just filled with rage, plotting escape.
But then in prison, he starts hearing about faith, especially the testimony of this one guy who'd been completely turned around. His struggle with the Bible is really striking, first rejecting it, then reading more, and just getting more and more miserable. He even tried a Catholic Bible, apparently, hoping it'd be different, but found it, quote, pretty much the same, only more lumbered up with notes.
This deep misery led to this intense, weeks-long battle with prayer. He felt too ashamed,
Yeah.
kneeling down, getting back up over and over, describing feeling like 10,000 people were watching him.
Until finally, desperation just hit, and he decided he was going to pray until some sense comes.
And the breakthrough itself, it's described with this almost physical intensity, kneeling, trembling, in agony, sweating, finally crying out, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner," and then experiencing this distinct voice or maybe a feeling saying, "My son, thy sins are forgiven." Along with a light and a sweet smell, he just started shouting praise.
But his path wasn't straight, even after prison. Loneliness, couldn't find work, fell back into drinking, stealing. He talks about that incident during the Idaho fire. They went intending to rob people, but ended up helping rescue drowning victims instead. But the regret was always there, driving him back to drink just to stop thinking.
That drowning incident in Brooklyn was another huge moment. Drunk, falls overboard, cries out to God in sheer desperation, feels like he's lifted up, and hears this voice saying, "Jerry, you've been saved for the last time." But even after that, his first reaction was to go get another drink.
The persistence of that city missionary was just crucial, wasn't it? The missionary, who was apparently initially afraid of Jerry's appearance, finds him on Cherry Street, gets him to the Howard mission, and Jerry's struggle with taking the pledge just shows how deep those habits were. He signs it thinking, it's no use, I'll break it, gets told to ask God for help, and then immediately breaks it.
But the missionary didn't give up, offered to pawn his own coat for Jerry, gave him 50 cents, kept checking on him daily. That led to a night at the missionary's house where Jerry prayed again, and this time experienced quiet and peace, a different kind of breakthrough.
His story rounds out with his marriage to Maria, their shared vision to do something for Jesus, starting the Helping Hand for Men in just one room on Water Street, holding meetings every night, and eventually helping thousands find a new life. That quote really sums it up. That's why I tell me some things of the story. The very time seems the ones that help the most. Man, never be ashamed to tell what I have been saved from.
It's such a powerful, personal picture of the kind of transformation the source argues is right at the heart of this mission work.
So moving on from McAuley, the source mentions there was quite a variety out there. It actually says 57 varieties of missions. It seems to group them broadly by how they were organized, like the Salvation Army, focused on efficiency, and also by doctrine.
Right. And while most were seen as good, endorsed by evangelical churches, the book is honest about the fact that there were extremists and faddists, groups that just couldn't really connect or work with the established churches, which led to some friction within the movement itself.
And the source really hammers home that the missions that lasted, the ones that endured, were the ones that stuck close to that core motto: no law but love, no creed but Christ.
A big challenge that gets discussed is how unapproved missions started springing up like mushrooms, especially in really needy areas where maybe the churches had pulled out. The book sees this as leading to wasted effort, duplicated resources, and just general confusion.
And interestingly, it puts some of the responsibility back on the established churches, suggesting they left a vacuum by not staying active in those fields. It argues that strong, approved missions actually served as a bulwark against these extremist groups taking hold.
Yeah, the suggested solutions were basically twofold. Ideally, churches should step up and do the work in those areas, but failing that, the approved missions needed to cooperate better amongst themselves. Though the book wryly notes that cooperation seemed easier between missions than it often was between different church denominations.
The source also looks at trends within the International Union of Gospel Missions over time. The first trend, moving away from just isolated individual efforts towards more cooperation, that's seen as a good thing.
The second, pushing for better organization and setting some standards, also viewed positively. But the third trend, changing methods to include more teaching, education, broader social work, that's presented as a bit more complex. Potentially good, but also potentially risky if it pulled focus away from the core spiritual mission.
But through all those changes, that central motto, no creed but Christ, no law but love, is constantly held up as the safe anchorage, the thing to hold on to.
Which brings us to the IUGM itself, the International Union of Gospel Missions, founded in 1913. Its whole purpose was to be this association of approved missions, helping them work together, develop standards, avoid stepping on each other's toes, support weaker missions, and hold conferences to share ideas.
But growth was slow at first, right? The book chalks that up to the really independent nature of these early missions and their leaders. Many of them, as we talked about, were powerful personalities that maybe didn't have a lot of formal organizational background.
A real turning point seems to have been the Minneapolis Convention in 1923. That apparently really expanded the Union's reach across the country and led to setting up these regional districts to try and get missions cooperating more on a local level.
And that kicked off a period of pretty rapid growth, both in membership and resources. That mission tour of America in 1925 sounds important too, laying the groundwork for the field secretary program people who would actually go out and support and connect the missions.
But then things slowed down again. A period of decline followed. The book suggests one factor might have been holding conventions in really distant places, making it hard for mission leaders, often on tight budgets, to even get there.
And then, bam, the Depression hit. The source notes the huge impact. The field secretary program had to be stopped because all available funds just had to go straight to relief efforts. The need was overwhelming.
But what's really striking is that even while the Union, as an organization, was struggling financially, the individual missions themselves are described as largely weathering the storm. They really rose to the occasion during the Depression, meeting that massive need, and then kept going through World War II as well.
It highlights the resourcefulness of these mission leaders, doesn't it? Finding wisdom, finding strength through prayer, often without the kind of formal training you'd expect in other fields.
Those regional district organizations were pretty key during this time, promoting local fellowship, tackling specific regional problems like issues with transient populations in some areas, and also trying to sort of sift through and endorse the legitimate missions, distinguishing them from the extremists. Though even the districts had their challenges, big distances, that independent streak, sometimes doctrinal clashes.
And the field secretaries, when they were active, played a vital role. Their job was to encourage and help missions, introduce standards, help recruit and train workers, prevent duplication, foster cooperation. The book mentions a few names like Peter Cortell, called the Songbird, J. Arthur Schlichter, who is apparently a very eloquent speaker known as America's Greatest Prodigal, and E.R. McKinney, a minister who founded several missions.
Now, the field secretary work wasn't without criticism. The book acknowledges that. But ultimately, it argues the value far outweighed the cost. It uses the St. Paul Union Gospel Mission as an example. Cost about $1,000 to get established with the Union's help, but then went on to spend over $2 million on relief and work over the next 40 years.
One really essential contribution, though maybe less often talked about, that the source really emphasizes, is the role of women in these rescue missions.
Yeah, it draws parallels to that virtuous woman passage in Proverbs 31, highlighting just how significant their contributions were.
Their roles were so varied and vital, often acting as the mothers of the mission.
Yeah.
Providing this crucial influence, especially on young men, but also working specifically with women who had fallen on hard times, with families, with children.
The source notes that women often brought real improvements to just the basic cleanliness and sort of domestic feel of the missions, and they were apparently held in very high respect by the men they served.
The book makes an interesting point, too, that Jesus' own teachings call for equality and independence for women, rejecting double standards, and that having these consecrated women workers genuinely lifted the whole tone of the mission and even boosted attendance.
A number of outstanding women get specific mentions. Mary Ann Gove, Mrs. John S. Bennett, Mrs. A.L. Jones, Mrs. E.M. Whitmore, Anna Kaiser, Mrs. Rosie Bernard, Mrs. William H. Ryerson, Mrs. E.T. Brigham, Mattie Volstad. But the source is quick to say, look, there were countless others doing amazing work just quietly in obscurity.
Okay, so let's pull back a bit and ask that core question the book keeps returning to. What is the real worth of the rescue mission? Why does this work fundamentally matter?
Well, the source positions it in relation to the church. The church is the greatest institution, it says, but the mission is like the arm of the church. And maybe even more profoundly, it states that the mission spirit is the heart of the Christian.
It makes such a strong connection to Jesus' most famous stories. The prodigal son, the lost sheep, the pool of Bethesda, the highways and hedges command, and that great judgment scene where the whole criteria is, I was a stranger and you took me in. It argues these are all fundamentally mission stories.
In fact, the source goes so far as to say the Bible itself is basically a great rescue mission book because so many of its central figures are shown caught up in sin or deep trouble, just desperately needing rescue.
So the two main functions get summarized as, first, reaching and winning the people the established church often misses, and second, providing this constant visible witness to Christ's saving power, specifically in areas where sin and hardship are really prevalent.
The source even points to church statistics of the time, suggesting that the rate at which members were sometimes suspended or dropped indicated a population the church struggled to keep engaged, highlighting again that unique reach of the missions.
A list of really key deceased mission leaders is provided, recognizing their foundational work. People like Jerry McAuley, of course, John R. McIntyre, E.J. Helms, who actually founded Goodwill Industries, which grew out of mission work. Harry Monroe, Mel Trotter, important figures.
And bringing it back to the definition one more time, the book reiterates, a mission is fundamentally this interdenominational effort, working in those neglected city areas, often places churches have moved out of. Its job is to share the gospel, yes, but also meet urgent physical needs, food, clothing, lodging, minister to the poor, whoever they are, regardless of background, and act as a kind of bridge between different parts of society.
The book uses that really striking analogy, comparing the church to a lighthouse high on the hill and the missions to the lower lights down closer to the dangerous shore. He even quotes that old hymn, "Trim your feeble lamp, some poor sailor tempest-tossed, in the darkest may be lost." It's about being right there where the danger is.
It then outlines 4 main types of missions discussed in the book. First, the pure gospel mission, almost entirely focused on evangelism. Second, the community mission, serving whole families in poor districts, kind of like an institutional church's outreach. Third, the welfare mission, using that physical aid, lodging, food as the primary way to open hearts to the gospel message. And fourth, the industrial mission, reaching men through work programs like Goodwill or the sort of tiered rehabilitation approach used at places like Pacific Garden Mission.
But the crucial insight, I think, is that the book really emphasizes effectiveness isn't mainly about which type of mission it is or the specific method. It's about the spirit behind it, a spirit that fits the leader, fits the community they're serving. That's what matters.
Yeah, and there's a long list of common activities that cuts across these types, showing the diverse ways that spirit showed up. Evangelism, of course, but also jail work, reaching people. While he is a social outcast, the book says, shop meetings, open-air preaching, providing lodging, running clubs, sometimes even hospital facilities or homes for those struggling with alcohol, direct relief, help finding jobs, friendly home visits, Bible classes, social centers that offered the community feel of a settlement house, but with that spiritual core and distributing tracts.
And the missioner's field is described as including the untouchable. Those with diseases people feared or just those society, maybe even some church members, tended to avoid. The source is careful to say this isn't a criticism of the church, just a reality check about the population missions serve. People who often need, well, cleaning up and some preparation before they could comfortably fit into a typical church setting. It mentions stats about hospital beds and the criminal population to show the scale of this need.
The mission field is also defined very simply by those Jesus talked about in the judgment scene. The hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and those in prison. That's the target group.
And the missioners themselves. The book says they are often these redeemed individuals, people with incredibly powerful personal stories, like J.C. Davis or John Callahan. While they were all different, the source stresses that personality is absolutely key. No one will ever make a success who does not have personality.
That story about Charles Langsman, the Apostle of Love, illustrates it perfectly, doesn't it? The book says he wasn't a great speaker, wasn't a great administrator, but he was a great mission man simply because of the man he was, echoing that "behold the man" description of Christ. It was about character.
The source really underscores the extraordinary ability required just to run even a small mission. You need continuous evangelism. You have to figure out funding, often without a built-in membership base. You're working with incredibly challenging people day in and day out, living amongst what often looks like failure, and managing all this without the typical support structures of a church denomination. It's tough work.
Which leads right back to that call for churches to get actively involved in mission work. Effective must be done by the churches, seeing it as their vital life-saving station. The book argues that churches really need to occupy this field, work cooperatively with those lower lights, partly to prevent unapproved, potentially harmful groups from dominating and causing confusion and waste.
Finally, the book looks towards the future, considers the enduring legacy of all this work.
Yeah, it reflects on the history, the ups and downs of the Union, the missions themselves, acknowledging that some important institutions and key leaders had been lost over time.
And it raises a really interesting challenge. Future leadership. The historical pattern, the book notes, was for leaders to come up from within the missions. Often these twice-born men, people with dramatic conversion stories, rather than primarily graduates from formal Bible schools or seminaries. It even shares an observation that, in its experience, seminary students who got some mission exposure usually went on to become pastors, not mission workers. Kind of poses that as a question, about training versus calling.
The source does suggest that the ministry itself could be another source for leaders, that maybe some ministers are just better suited for the unique demands of rescue work.
But ultimately, the book says, look, the challenge of finding and developing good leaders belongs to everyone involved. It suggests missions need to be careful, to really observe and lay hands on capable individuals, referencing that biblical idea of not appointing people too quickly, implying they need to learn from past mistakes while making sure this vital work keeps going.
And the importance of churches being involved is hit one last time. It's seen as critical for effectively reaching the field, preventing that confusion from questionable groups.
And the book ends, really, on a note of hope, rooted in that core conviction that souls will keep rising out of sin and despair through this kind of work, and that their stories, their testimonies of God's saving power, will continue to strengthen the church as a whole.
So this deep dive through Dr. Paul's The Romance of Rescue, it's really taken us on quite a journey, hasn't it? From ancient biblical times right up to the streets of 19th and 20th century American cities, exploring these enduring principles, the incredible people involved, and the persistent challenges they faced in doing gospel and rescue mission work.
It really is a history defined by this unwavering spirit, this drive to reach out to people society often overlooks. Whether you see it in those biblical figures or the early church converts or these transformative figures like Jerry McAuley, is powerful stuff.
So as you, our listener, reflect on this historical journey, what really stands out to you about the nature of compassion, about community support? How might this perspective maybe influence how you look at acts of rescue, acts of outreach in your own community today?
And here's maybe a final thought to leave you with, something drawn right from the source material. Consider that ongoing tension, that push and pull between structured institutions like the church and the raw, often messy grassroots reality of ministry among the most vulnerable people down there near the shore, as the hymn says. How do we navigate that? How do we balance necessary organization and standards with the deeply personal, sometimes difficult human work of meeting people exactly where they are, right in the middle of their greatest need?
We hope you enjoy this episode and that it both inspires and equips you to serve the least, the last, and the lost in Jesus' name. You can find the show notes for this episode and subscribe to our newsletter at rescuemissions.cityvision.edu. If you would like to learn more about City Vision University's courses and degree programs, visit our website at www.cityvision.edu.